Welcome back. And now to Syria, where heavy shelling continues and 60 more people were killed today, according to the opposition. This comes just 2 days after the United Nations voted to send as many as 300 observers into the country. That resolution lacked the threat of sanctions because Russia and China won't support it. And both countries have been slow to support stronger measures against Bashar Assad, even as he continues to slaughter his own people. Now the question of why. So joining me to talk about this is Vitaly Churkin, Russia's ambassador to the United Nations. Ambassador, thank you for being with us.
My pleasure.
We had a very strong statement from my previous guest, activist and philosopher Bernard-Henri Lévy, who, as you know, led the intervention or persuaded the international intervention in NATO.
I'm not aware of that, but maybe this isn't in fact the case.
Right. It pretty much is. He basically said that it's shameful that the same kind of intervention is not happening, as every single day what did not happen in Benghazi is happening in Homs and other parts of Syria.
Well,
do you not feel that to some extent?
Well, first of all, by and large, people admit that Libya is not Syria. Syria is not Libya.
Right.
And we must remember
but beyond that, there
we
is
must remember it very clearly, because the situation is much more complex in Syria. And what the regime changers were offering in the resolutions which Russia and China vetoed, 2 of those resolutions, was further confrontation, because it meant a frontal attack on the Assad government, frontal calls for him to leave, and he was not about to do that. And opinion polls in Syria were showing that over 50% of the population didn't want him to leave. So,
but opinion polls in a country like that are somewhat suspect,
opinion
you
polls
must
conducted by independent, all those figures, they do not always come from reliable sources. The opinions I have seen were coming from Syria. Some of the reports of the casualties in Syria come from London. So, we have to, but the important thing is that the way to deal with the situation in Syria is to establish a political process. This is still a missing link. One thing we already have in place. We have a Security Council resolution, incidentally initiated by Russia, adopted last Saturday, for the deployment of the monitoring mission. Our expectation, our hope, is that as they deploy, it will be very difficult to conduct violence in Syria for both sides.
But it still is happening, even though the resolutions have been implemented.
They just have 10 people on the ground. Of course, if the Syrian government continues to use heavy weapons in the cities, that would mean that they are breaching the commitment they made only last Saturday.
But why do you think they would not breach their commitment, since they have breached their commitments every single time that you and others have tried to get them to abide by commitments?
Because I think they must realize that by force alone, this crisis cannot be settled.
But do you think they realize that, or do they think exactly the opposite?
I think they do. I think they realize. But
what evidence do you have to back that up?
Well, because when we suggested 2 or 3 months ago for the government to come to Moscow and have a dialogue with the opposition, including at the vice president level, you might recall that the Arab League wanted the vice president to speak on behalf of the Syrian authorities in the dialogue with the opposition. They immediately accepted. It was the opposition who refused to come and talk to the government. This is one thing which is missing. We need stopping the violence, monitoring the cessation of violence, and we also need the opposition to accept dialogue with the government.
Do you believe, I mean seriously, I know that's your position, but do you really believe that after all of this, after more than a year of this, or after all the slaughter, there is a possibility of a dialogue that leaves President Assad in power, or even a dialogue that's credible?
I do. Well, what is he going to stay in power or not is not a matter of concern to us. Our concern is that it must be a Syrian-led, all-inclusive political process. What the outcome of that process is going to be, it's a completely another proposition. But in order for that to be determined, the dialogue must take place. And this, I hope...
Do you really think that there is time for that now, after all this slaughter?
All conflicts end with some kind of a political deal. The only difference is it going to happen now, or is it going to require 3-4 more years of bloodshed? And like we had in Iraq, over 100,000 civilians killed. This is the only difference.
You said that all conflicts end with a political deal. Obviously, it didn't happen like that in Egypt. Mubarak stepped down. It didn't happen like that in Libya. Gaddafi was killed. Yemen, perhaps it did. Tunisia, it didn't happen. The president left. You just raised something at the beginning. You called them regime changes. Is that Russia's issue? Is that I'm trying to figure out the nub of your problem, why you don't even agree to sanctions, why there is nothing held over the government's head to force them to do what you want them to do. Is it about regime change?
Well, there are sort of two different issues. First of all, as a matter of principle, we believe that the UN Security Council is not about regime change. We believe that if there is a crisis in a country, the role of the international community should be to help the parties involved to find a political, peaceful way out of this crisis. And when we saw some of the resolutions which included sanctions, we knew that those were resolutions which were heading in the direction of regime change by force, which would in turn lead only to much more bloodshed in Syria, because in contrast to Gaddafi, President Assad does have a strong armed force. He does have support among the population. So this easy way, which incidentally in Libya, 30 to 50,000 people were killed. And the country is still in a very difficult state. So even in Libya, it is not a simple proposition at all. But in Syria, the national and regional consequences would have been dramatic. So we were against that kind of a scenario.
You mentioned the military, but first I want to ask you this, because it's really important. Do you have a threshold? Does Russia have a threshold? Is it, right now the UN and others say 10,000 people have been killed since this started more than 13 months ago. I mean, is it another few hundred? Is it another few thousand? Is it 100,000 have to die before Russia decides that this is enough?
What has happened already is unacceptable. 10,000, they say, civilians. The government says almost 6,000 people on their side. We already have something which resembles a civil war. We need to have a political track.
Is there a threshold?
Well,
does Russia say this is enough?
In our view, the threshold has been exceeded already. You know, in our view, the conflict could have been stopped last August, when we initiated a presidential statement in the Security Council which said all parties must stop violence from all sides, violence must be stopped, and there must be Syrian-led political process, all-inclusive political process. Instead, the regime change scenario stepped in, which we had to block by our vetoes in the Security Council.
And you've also been, so you are blocking what you believe to be regime change. You've also said, you yourself have been quoted as saying this latest resolution proves that the Libya model has been retired. Is this payback for what you believe to have been double dealing over the Libya model?
No, it's not a payback, but we need to be particularly careful, because what we saw in the situation of Libya was that the Security Council resolution was manipulated, and its terms were greatly exceeded by those who were effecting the regime change in Libya. And you should understand, our problem is not with Gaddafi having been overthrown. After all, our relations with Gaddafi were much more remote than of those countries who actually overthrew him. Our problem is that the price of it was the manipulation of decisions of the Security Council. So every time we look now at a draft of Security Council resolutions in similar situations, we have to be very careful in not allowing any misinterpretation of those resolutions.
But you also have said, and your president has said, that this is our ally, and we don't just turn against our ally. You also sell weapons to the Syrians.
They are not our allies. We don't have an alliance. This is a country with which we had a long, friendly relationship.
Okay, long, friendly relationship. You don't want to turn against your friend.
Yeah, I think this is a factor. If it's a friendly country, we wanted to come to find a shortcut, if you will, if after 13 months of bloodshed, this expression can be used, to peaceful outcome of the crisis. And we don't believe that frontal regime change operation, which was started by some hotheads in the Arab League and supported in some Western capitals, is going to produce a short political solution.
Let me take you back to the 90s. Russia opposed the intervention in Kosovo, and yet it was your own former prime minister, after 78 days of NATO bombardment, who went and got Milosevic to pull back and to say enough is enough. That led to the fall of Milosevic and democracy in Serbia. I mean, how bad can that be? You were on the right side of history in the end there.
Well, you know, only history will decide who was on the right side and wrong side.
It's democratic in Serbia.
But listen, we are of course, a comparison of Serbia and Syria is even more remote than Libya and Syria. There is nobody who's more active diplomatically than Russia. Very tough talk with the government in Damascus. Everybody recognizes that we were the ones who saved at least twice the Kofi Annan mission in Syria. We also involve opposition leaders, various opposition groups come to Moscow. We talk to them in various places. So, you know, we are extremely active across the diplomatic and political spectrum.
We hope to continue this conversation, Mr. Churkin, Ambassador Churkin, because many also don't believe that the Annan process has much of a chance of succeeding. But we will watch, and we hope to invite you back here again.
Thank you. Let's think positively.
Thank you, and we'll be right back.